fact, the people who are the real producers on a movie are usually they're usually called line producers, and they're lower down on the totem pole.
I
Everybody's
don't know if you want to share this with the world. We're on live stream now.
oh, thank you, ladies and gentlemen. It is
Sorry.
time for this and that.
This and that.
Take it away, Anne.
Finally.
Professor Anne.
All right, welcome to This and That. It's the 12th of December. I came across a interchange between on Blue Sky between Soren Mao, the guy who wrote the recent text on a new text on Marx, and some folks, and so I thought that I would include the thread because it was pertinent to today. Today we're going to continue talking about what I was talking about yesterday, but I thought I would lead in with the the idea that, well, let's just start here. I think you'll find this interesting. Soren Mao is making a comment on Marx in Capital Volume 3. Marx writes that he wants to examine capitalism in its idealen Durchschnitt. This is usually translated as ideal average, but I believe the more accurate translation would be ideal cross-section. I think this is a geological metaphor rather than a mathematical one. The issue, of course, is whether, from a humanist point of view, that you can make these kinds of sort of claims, considering that Marx used lots of metaphors, and that whether this is a new idea, not so new, considering how late in his life Marx started looking more seriously at geology, but um, it has nice illustrations. And so this is Soren Mao again. I think he might have been inspired by geological illustrations of the ideal cross-section of the Earth, which seems to have been common in 19th century Germany. This interpretation also aligns better with what Marx actually does in Capital. That may be true, but I think he goes to geology specifically much later in his life, a couple of years before he dies. Providing an account of capitalism and its ideal average, because that's what's going to be discussed later on in the other things I'm going to talk about, in a mathematical sense, would involve comparing different capitalist societies and emphasizing what they have in common. So, Soren Mao is looking for a metaphor, something that begins to average out, perhaps, totalize the discourse. A cross section, on the other hand, involves cutting through a particular capitalist society to describe its fundamental structure, its inner organization, as Marx also writes in the same passage. As for ideal, it means that it is not an actual cross section, but an imagined one. This is kind of the humanist direction in general. This aligns with Marx's point in the preface to Capital about how neither microscopes nor chemical reagents are of use in the analysis of economic forms. Instead, the force of abstraction must replace both. So you can sort of see where Soren Mao is going. In the same, in another passage in the same manuscript, Marx talks about the core structure, the Kernstruktur, usually translated as basic inner structure of capital. I'm wondering if that's also a geological metaphor. And so there's he puts in a little thing from his page. I think this is the chapter 4 from his book, Transformation of Commodity Capital and Money Capital into Commodity Dealing Capital and Money Dealing Capital, or into Merchants Capital. Needless to say, this describes financialization or finance capital. And so you can sort of see where he's headed. Now, what's interesting, of course, is the thread of people responding to his, I don't know what they're called, bleeps, bleats, skeets, whatever. So one person responds, ideal average is probably grounded in his influence from Quetelet, who associated the average with the ideal. He was influential at the time, and Marx read him carefully. And then another person, Doreen Massey, would have had a lot to say about this fascinating thread, having herself used and occasionally distanced herself from geological metaphors for capitalist uneven development, layers of disinvestment, etc. And Trevor Barnes speculates that Marx could have picked up this idea from von Humboldt, who is producing exactly those kinds of geological cross sections of South America, where he spent several years in the early 19th century. A question for some person on B-Sky Social, perhaps. I'd agree that cross section is the proper translation, and that hence a geological metaphor is logical. I'm insufficiently knowledgeable about genealogies of German geo-thought to confirm or deny explicit connections to Humboldt or other 19th century scholars. Another person says, such an interesting thread. Idealen Durchschnitt could be ideal average, but I find your reasoning quite convincing. Although then it would be good to look for referenced work, as a comment suggested. I'd be wary of using metaphors/concepts from the natural world to describe social formations, because this path has been done before. The scientific method can also be misused. Both imply stasis. Capitalism is dynamic. Surely Marx tried to use the dialectic to understand its movement and contradictions. So you could see kind of where the thread was going, but it was a nice, intelligent little thread, and that was sort of nice. Nobody tried to, well, actually, a couple of people tried to troll him, but needless to say. And this is perhaps an idealized one. It is a one from a very different source, and is a description of exactly the same things we were looking at before, except this is more current day, and is clearly geological, and talks about all these other sorts of things. And I asked Gemini about this, and so Gemini, even though I knew the fact earlier on from reading Bellamy Foster, Karl Marx's interest in geology appears to have been during the later part of his life, specifically around 1878. This was a period when he's exploring various scientific and philosophical ideas, including those related to the natural world, including soil science, for example. His notes on geology reveal a deep interest in the geological processes that shape the earth and their connection to human history. So all of those metaphoric questions are interesting, and because that's kind of what we're doing with this triad of value, rent, and finance. And for those who weren't here yesterday, essentially the co-authors of this article are looking at various forms to show that financialization has within itself something that structurally connects, that allows us to talk about financialization in sort of the same way, or without worrying so much about the congealed globules of labor argument, but not to detach it from that, but at least to articulate all the underlying connections which do have labor implied, however abstracted. The connection is still there, and the logic is still there. So what we're looking at, as Michael Hudson was trying to show empirically in his discussion of the 2008, 2009, 2007 through 9 financial crisis, that there was something going on, that it did require, a lot of action and activity, mainly, lawyers, actually, and that kind of gets to, certain other issues that are brought up by other scholars about how legal things operate, code of capital, etc. So it is a reflection also on Brett Christopher's work on financialization of nature, and sort of the success and failures of that. And so it has a dialectic structure in terms of asking certain questions about, well, where is this coming from? Is it external or is it internal? And the important thing is to look at the commodification, or the the things that make it logically cohere to the idea of a commodity. That's kind of what goes on in financialization, although it's certainly within a smaller or a more refined or whatever specialized market. But financial services are commodities. They highlight the exploitation of labor and the technical work required for the production of risk-bearing assets, as Christopher says. Now, it's more than what Christopher is talking about in terms of risk or insurance premiums, and essentially, this idea of playing with assets and commodification is like really important. And so the three authors here follow the internal relation between rent and the circulation of interest-bearing capital to unpack the social relations of private monopoly ownership that mediate the capitalization of revenue streams attached to nature and infrastructure. And doing so significantly deepens our knowledge of how value is extracted from particular material geographies implicated in the capitalization of everything. Indeed, the rent finance link is suggestive of other geologic contexts in which the revenue streams or raw materials of financialization rest on monopoly ownership in sectors not subject to the competitive equalization of profit rates. So this is the whole point, is that you have a smaller group of people, hedge funders, private equity, the things that Hudson talks about, that, things are done in private equity that often are unregulated, et cetera, and we can apply it, of course, to other kinds of Ponzi-like elements, for example, crypto. So in this vein, we read rent and finance as one-sided abstractions. Now, I don't know, I need to do further work on this, but it seems contradictory or counterintuitive to talk about one-sided abstractions. But anyway, that's another story. And I have to read Elson, which I haven't read, and blah, blah, blah. Or phenomenal forms of value crystallizing in determinate historical and geographical conditions. So the crucial problem for analyzing the financialization of infrastructure is to understand why rent and finance take the forms that they do within the capitalization, that is the valorization of the asset. So it gets back to what I was trying to do with sublation, valorization, and indexicality. I know I've already baffled you, but it seems to me that there are other ways of commenting on it that are not just big words, but that they actually describe this kind of dynamic in ways that are not only intelligible to humanists, but also at some moment are quantifiable. And so that's ultimately my goal. But we can sort of travel along here because they pick on the one hand a hitherto a complicated kind of asset that is water, and particularly the privatization of water in the UK. So it's particularly complicated, and I don't think I think we can go there, certainly, and that's where they go. Although ultimately, as the story goes, what they're talking about are different ways to sort of play with the sort of assets that might be referred to in your water bill, for example. And yes, they can, things can happen that make water bills out of control. Or, for example, police often use high consumption of water to indicate that a indoor marijuana farm is going on, so that you can actually, it's an indicator of something else going on. So as a sign, that's kind of important. So anyway, they're doing, of course, the financialization of water, showing how the model sort of works. But the important thing is applying the Marxian categories of monopoly and absolute rent. In the final section, we explore existing studies of financialization of water in order to demonstrate how value, rents, and finance are internally related moments comprising the process of financialization. So the goal, of course, is to provide some sort of general analytic that pursues some of these ideas further on, and in a slightly different direction than Christopher's does with risk assetization, because that's kind of what went on with the great financial crisis, that these were being sort of moved around and not properly supported, and of course they got into trouble and then brought down the economies, and needed to be sort of bailed out, as the state often does. So on the one hand, we're sort of trying to get to that, to understand the materiality that exists in things that are less material. This is sort of the whole point of this exercise. And it is the one that describes what David Harvey does as a fictitious capital. And the fact that something is fictitious doesn't necessarily mean that it doesn't have a certain degree of materiality. So this is the whole point at which we sort of say, well, at what point do you want to push this and say, well, how much labor is being exploited? And it's less about the labor that's being exploited, but perhaps looking in the other direction is that everything is capitalized. And this is the problem of human capital. And ultimately, probably in another venue far, far away, the idea of Gary Becker's human capital needs to be sort of critiqued further, despite his Nobel Prize. So, laying out 5 theses, they're going to talk about different versions of this, and develop a kind of where Matt Huber, for example, is sort of trying to go in terms of integrating issues about nature and ecosystems, and ultimately the climate crisis. Now, Matt Huber tries to go to a different direction, and talks about ultimately about reconnecting with elements of the class struggle. And so that's a whole different thing. And we're not going to talk about that here necessarily. But it is important to look at how value is produced by the dialectical unity of labors dash nature, and but trying to get there is could be problematic. They add on Adriana Blasho's work about the appropriation of rents and the manner in which natural conditions enable reduced or increased rents, which raises an interesting question and ultimately gets us to surplus value. But probably somebody is probably working on this already, is the idea of rent during COVID as being an interesting problem, of the deferrals or the supports, the throwing $600 at people, et cetera. But back to Blasio emphasizes not only the connection between surplus value and rent. This is where it's coming from. Where is it that you take rent out of? You're not taking it out of sort of income or revenue, but or profit, but rather it comes out of surplus value. So if you have to distinguish the difference between profit and surplus value in the same breath. So there is a connection between surplus value and rent, but it is different in the way in which socio-environmental change has become important economic implications for the operation of capitalism. So, fiddling with value has a deep and interesting history, and there are a variety of arguments for understanding value as a critical category. And it doesn't get us too tied up anyway, with the sort of Heinrich value form argument. You don't have to argue about value form, even though I think it has its benefits. It also sort of avoids, much like a lot of other literature does, analysis does, with the question of not worrying so much about defending the labor theory of value, but looking at advanced forms of late capitalism and noting that there is ultimately still a through line, or a vein, as it were, or a a difference between sort of layers of geology that create earthquakes, for example. And so anyway, this is this idea of a value theory of nature. But it is what they come down to is the question of whether these elements are distinct or independent or dependent variables in this particular process. And so Elson's alternative is to develop a philosophy of internal relations that analyzes different moments or aspects crystallizing in different forms according to historically and geographically determinate conditions. In such a reading, labor time becomes an immanent measure of value. This gets back to our sublation question that should be read in relation to the external measure of value in the form of money. So essentially, we're doing somewhat clerk-like work and trying to go to what Marx originally conceives of in volume 1. That is that there is some structural condition that continues the argument about commodities to get to money as a commodity form, or the money commodity, and then to money. And so we're looking at that kind of moment when these things happen, even though they happen quite quickly. So in many respects, we would argue that Elson's work can be used to critique more simplistic analyses of financialization, as well as to critique more nuanced approaches that appear to take categories such as value and finance as discrete. Instead, the triadic analysis that we go on to develop seeks to understand the phenomenal forms in which value comes to appear. And so, this is value, rent, and finance sort of triangulate in sort of interesting ways. But one-sided abstraction still seems problematic to me, but finance and rent could be read as one-sided abstractions or phenomenal forms of value. Now, ultimately, this implies that whole question of the moment. That is, why is it that we only understand things when turnovers happen, when it changes or shifts, which is the dynamic element. So there's still social forms of wealth. They still require people, whether it's the professional managerial class or investors or whatever. These abstractions are still important in that context. So financialization can be understood a la Pastone as a unintentional effort to abolish value within a framework that remains structured by value. So this is kind of where that whole thing about creative destruction is sort of coming from. The idea that the tendency towards crisis, eventually the pyramid falls, the Ponzi scheme becomes revealed. As the accumulation of value slows down, the search for wealth becomes perversely reflexive, like an autoimmune disease. It begins to feed on the substance of society and nature. So in that sense, it can, it's a little too metaphorical, but it does support the notion that, there is a tendency of the rate of profit to fall. Monopoly capital or monopoly profits in that sense become utilized in problematic ways, and ultimately, crisis occurs. Now, the question, of course, going back to the 19th century, and it seemed much more vital and existential then, was that all these darn capitalist crises are going to, from which we're going to get socialism, and of course it gets diverted or perhaps directed when you get actually existing socialism, or at least the claim for actually existing socialism in the Soviet Union. Hence our entire body of obsession with trying to either retcon communism as a mode of production, when in fact it was only really existing socialism, which is not the same as really existing communism. But you can see how people were sort of in a hurry. Lenin was in a hurry, and noting, of course, that there were other things. History intervened. Lenin gets shot. Stalin essentially vampirically, one might assert, sort of kidnaps Lenin, and he they don't describe it as kidnapping, but he sort of controls the last. I would say after the assassination attempt, I think Lenin is not quite as well, and I think so many other things get manipulated, and Stalin, as Lasordo, speaking of Lasordo, points out, is that because Stalin was in charge of personnel affairs, that is, membership, let's put it that way, party organization, he was able to manipulate the direction of the party until Lenin dies, of course, and of course the irony is, Stalin dying, blah blah blah, which is made fun of more recently in theatrical form. So, on the question of rent, it is a phenomenal form of value. A rent is a payment, a concrete form of surplus value, commanded by private monopoly ownership to the exclusion of all others. This is privatization, right? And the different categories of rent capture the ways in which this monopoly is economically realized or valorized. And so all those things are there. It's a heterodox spirit. There are material and immaterial commodity forms in contemporary financialized capitalism which have a price but no value. That's David Harvey. Unlike industrial commodities and the modified value relations of nature-based production, it's the price of commodities produced on the least productive marginal lands for which there is solvent demand that determines market price. That's the kind of standard version. So capital's competing to produce on lands of superior quality or location, remember, land, labor, capital, will be forced to cede extraordinary profits above the margin to the landlord in the form of differential rent valorized through a higher rental price. And you could argue that that's kind of what's going on in feudalism. Hence, Yanis Varoufakis, and the critique or advancement of a kind of neo-feudalism, which is going on, which is kind of what is going on. There are, monopoly capital forms, and they are working through differential rent questions. Now, what our triangulated model here does is sort of, as opposed to what our friend Basu tries to do, is we don't assume that absolute rent is either a constant or zero or null, but rather it's actually much more important. And that's sort of at the end of all this. So owing to the barrier of landed property, and now we get into this interesting question of property questions at the level of forms of property, for example, digital property, in terms of, or abstract versions like intellectual property. Capital must pay an additional portion of surplus value to access even marginal lands in the form of absolute rent. That's kind of the idea that's being toyed with here, or that can be toyed, or at least as a kind of contradiction or a measure against which an index of how much difference is being produced, let's put it that way. The source of this surplus value derived from the lower organic composition of capital, that is the ratio of labor to capital, within agriculture, allowing landowners to claim absolute rent without agricultural products selling at prices above their value. So there is this kind of differential question that Marx asks and uses absolute rent as a way to measure the differential. While the value constitution of this category is the subject of ongoing controversy, as we explained below, it does not rest on the technical conditions of production, but the barrier created by private monopoly. And then the third, much less controversial category is that of monopoly rents, according to which the owners of special and limited resources can charge a monopoly price formed independently of the price of the product as determined by prices of production and value. Therefore, for analytical purposes, and to oversimplify somewhat, differential rent is mediated by competition within a sector. Absolute rent revolves around class power and barriers erected against competition and the equalization of profit rates. And monopoly rent pertains to the unique qualities of land or a non-substitutable character of a commodity. So you have all of the things are there to sort of work through this, and there are a variety of empirical possibilities, particularly from a research point of view, that is fisheries, mining, land and water, woodlands, rural sociology, urban monopoly rents, housing markets, geopower of the capitalist state, tribal land systems, the new international division of labor, global commodity chains, and biodiversity offsetting. So a lot of stuff. It illustrates the distance the literature has traveled from earlier debates, which bifurcated over the need for a general theory of rent and mid-range typologies equipped for specific empirical analysis of urban land and real estate markets. So often this was all still defined by sort of simple divisions. In many ways, the gulf between totalizing theories, varying degrees of fidelity to value theory, and those interested in specific empirical questions points to why rent has long been a knotty concept between Marxian political economy, within Marxian political economy. Yet, the new challenge looks to be to take the categories of rent beyond land and the analysis of capitalism, increasingly reliant on flows of rentier income. You see, we finally get to it. Rentier income through financial instruments. And so, particularly in terms of urban political economy, and, it can be argued, as Moreno does, that rent has become the operative form of social value in a spatial system of accumulation dominated by financial interests. And as a result, the urban process therefore becomes a conduit through which financial intermediaries are able to take commissions, fees, bonuses, and so on directly out of the urban circulation of capital. You can see how this operates within the context of the 2007 great financial crisis, because it does function in that kind of way, even though it is more related to, in fact, suburbanization in the big picture, because it was this sort of getting people to, supporting bad mortgages or subprime, et cetera, and creating more bubbles in that particular sense. So it all still comes together. What we're looking at is sort of the details of this financial element, and to see how consonant it is, and different authors have taken different approaches to this. So it is possible, as Harvey does, to talk about accumulation by dispossession that are constitutive of the appropriation of surplus value in the form of rent. That might be called value grabbing, or like land grabbing, which does happen. It's unfortunately far too common. But it is at a high level of abstraction without specifying the categorical foundations of how rent is captured. This ultimately gets us back to some of the details of finance and financialization. So in the urban context, David Harvey was clearly wrestling with the value theoretical implications of ground rent in two pioneering papers which analyzed the class power of landlords over scarce resources and the emergent power of finance capital as a spatial entity. And he tried to go at this in a variety of ways, and a kind of play, as it were, on the fictitious capital thing that occurs in Harvey's text on limits of capital. Harvey settled on the tentative category of class monopoly rent as one form of absolute rent to shed light on the abuse of class-based monopoly power over land and resources which redlined and exploited urban communities. So ultimately, we can get to this place of estrangement, alienation, appropriation, all of those things which are kind of, needless to say, class-based, and have within them kind of class stuff going on. So, and to make it relevant, I think there were special codes in the Trump organizations, in the original discrimination suit brought by the federal government against Trump, father of Trump, and Trump, on the basis of racial discrimination, because they would code applications with by race in terms of whether they were going to rent to people or not, et cetera. And so anyway, Yet the heuristic implications of the category were subsequently sidelined when Harvey confronted the problem to define a coherent theory of ground rent within the framework of value theory itself. This is significant because the resolution of this problem is actually embedded in what has become a highly influential and widely cited contribution to the financialization of land and property literature. That is, the tendency to treat the land as a pure financial asset. However, as is often the case with the selective engagement with landmark texts, the substance of Harvey's theorization and the link with rent theory has largely gone unremarked. Yes. Harvey's solution was in line with new rent theory, which prioritized the category of differential rent, sidelining absolute and monopoly forms of rent as small and sporadic. That's kind of where Basu is currently or recently. By incorporating the dynamics of finance and rent theory through the concept of fictitious capital, Harvey was able to argue that the circulation of interest-bearing capital in search of enhanced future ground rents promotes activities on the land that conform to highest and best use, which makes the appropriation of rent socially necessary. So you can see that Marx's original critique of Ricardo on rent sort of makes a little sense, and you can see that that alienation existed at both the concrete and abstract levels. Now, this allowed Harvey to analytically trace the flow of urban differential rents as an uneven and crisis-prone mechanism in the production of capitalist space, but the positive coordinating role assigned to rent in the form of interest-bearing capital endowed the analysis with a heavy dose of functionalism. Now, that's a kind of bugaboo that, functionalism is sort of the mechanical kind of critique that occurred even in the 19th and early 20th century. Although the earlier connection between high finance and the rent extraction of monopoly rent was hinted at in more recent work, Harvey has confirmed that he believes absolute rent simply doesn't work and instead differentiates between direct, that is, prime real estate or works of art, and indirect, commodities and services produce the unique attributes of the land location, and between direct and indirect forms of monopoly rent, which, is not a bad, at least tentative conclusion, because we can certainly see with the $6 million banana that, this is kind of what's going on, or at least you could characterize it that way. Now, revisiting these nuances is not an excuse to indulge in Marxiology or Marxology, but it is of strategic importance in thinking through the rent-land nexus that underpins contemporary monopoly forms of ownership, such as a sovereign wealth fund owning large swaths of London's housing stock, a pension fund owning distant urban infrastructures, or hedge funds driving land grabbing in the global south. Indeed, following 2008, as a way out of an overaccumulation crisis, the financial sector has been switching from lending money to direct ownership of land and urban infrastructure for the extraction of rent. This is, see, we're right at Michael Hudson. We're at the example of Bill Gates buying land. All of this has that kind of possibility of explanation. And you could even say a monopoly form of ownership, such as a sovereign wealth fund, for example, is a strategic cryptocurrency reserve. So, Charles Ponzi is alive and well. As Park has pointed out, urban spaces with their fragmented uses and specific features make absolute and monopoly rent important, gentrification. Therefore, for the purposes of our intervention, it is important to note a reappraisal of absolute rent. We, in the absence of technical conditions of backwardness, that is low organic composition of capital redolent of 19th century agriculture, absolute rent exists whenever a rentier or asset owning class can impose or benefit from barriers to competition and escape surplus and capture surplus value from a monopoly price of the product. In other words, this is why neo-feudalism is still appropriate in the sense of you're enclosing, you erecting barriers to competition, creating surplus value from the position of a kind of monopoly price. So you can say that absolute rent is actually fairly important. You can use it to think through carbon emission allowances, pharmaceutical patents, seed patents, electricity and water privatization in post-crisis Greece. Such enclosures give rise to all manner of rent-bearing revenue streams, increasingly packaged as financial securities, that is, commodities with a price, sold in the form of fictitious capital for the future income that they will yield. So you can imagine that this does operate, and it operates at a variety of levels. So that, for example, fracking investment, which has, with all due respect, probably less risk for a variety of probably technical reasons, less risk than just strict drilling for oil. You can see that this is a moment where people can sort of profit on the on manipulating the acquisition or accumulation of mineral rights, right? So that's why drill baby drill is important, because it just means profit. And it's not really about drill baby drill, but it's frack baby frack. And because of the proportion of capital available in that kind of process. So Hyla has proposed the concept of derivative rent to capture how the yield from land titles are securitized and traded on the market as a financial instrument. And let me just stop there, because I've really gone over my allotted time, which I frittered away in sleep. I think I'll just, because we're only halfway through this stupid article. It's not a stupid article. It's actually a very important article for me, very important, because it sort of puts out all the things that I needed to look at in one place, which I find quite advantageous. Not all the things, a significant number of the things, and that's all a good thing. So let me stop right here. I'll continue this on Monday, because we're going to try and do, whenever it's available, probably the closing session, which should come out this week, of the CSSGJ series with Andy Higginbottom on Marx's volume 2 of Capital. So with all of those things fiddling around in the air, let me stop for the moment, see if there are any questions, comments, or brickbats. All right, anyway, seeing none, I will, assuming that I have been given control, are going to stop the live stream. I will